Have you ever noticed how so often what looks the most powerful and impressive can actually hide the deepest weakness? Everyone thought he was just a cold, distant, unreachable man. Some admired him for his wealth. Others feared him for his power. But no one would have ever guessed that behind it all, there was a heart bowed before God. My name is Kylie Harmon. I'm 38 years old. I live in New York City, and I used to work as a receptionist at one of the biggest companies in town. To most people, I was invisible. But it was in that place of anonymity that I witnessed something that changed my life forever. What I saw that afternoon alone in the office seemed impossible. A billionaire surrounded by security and luxury, hiding in an empty room, on his knees, praying in tongues. Can you picture that? The whole world runs after signs of power and mansions, cars, and money. And there I was, discovering that true wealth was found in a man who prayed in secret. That's where the paradox lies. The higher someone rises before men, the lower they need to bow before God. And it was in that secret that I found the answer to my own loneliness, to the pain of feeling unseen, and to the doubt of whether God still writes love stories. 6 months later, that same man asked me to marry him. I don't know if you've ever felt like just another face in the crowd. That was exactly my reality in New York City. Every day, I blended into the rush of people, everyone chasing their own dreams, while I headed to my job as a receptionist at a big company. A simple life in a giant city. And honestly, many times it felt like no one even noticed I was there. Working at that front desk taught me a lot about observing people. I saw everything from nervous interns to executives in expensive suits who barely looked at the person behind the counter. Deep down, I knew my role was just to open doors, answer calls, and smile. But the truth is, while I seemed invisible to many, I carried dreams inside me that went far beyond the walls of that building. Dreams I wasn't even sure I'd ever have the courage to pursue. Sometimes I wondered, is this really the life God planned for me? Sitting here watching everyone else's stories unfold while I don't even begin to write my own? That question stayed with me like a silent prayer. I believed faith wasn't only about waiting for miracles, but also about realizing that even the smallest details were part of the testimony he was building in me. Still, there was an emptiness inside, like I was always standing in someone else's shadow. You know that feeling of being an extra in the movie of your own life? That's exactly how I felt. I watched directors, business leaders, and big names walk through the lobby while I was always there, smiling, helpful, but never with the chance to show who I really was. Even in my prayers, I would ask, Lord, when will it be my turn? When will my story step out of the shadows? My mom, a woman of unshakable faith, always used to say, Kylie, don't underestimate small beginnings because God can turn any routine into a stage for miracles. But me, impatient like any daughter, I thought it sounded nice but far from my reality. To me, life looked like a never-ending loop. Crowded subway rides, a busy reception desk, shallow conversations, and days that slipped by too quickly. And deep down, I knew something had to change. The interesting thing is, even when we think nothing special is happening, God is already moving pieces we cannot see. I didn't know it then, but that same routine, that plain uniform, and even the passing glances that never lingered on me were all leading me toward an encounter that would change not only my path, but also the life of someone who seemed to have it all, and yet was hiding a secret that would transform mine forever. In that world of glass and concrete, there was one figure who seemed to dominate every hallway without ever raising his voice: Richard Cole. He was the owner of the company, the billionaire with a stern face and an almost intimidating presence. Always in a flawless suit, with measured steps and a gaze that could pierce through anyone, Richard was both respected and feared. People used to say that a single expression from him could change the entire course of a meeting. From the reception desk, I watched how everyone behaved when he walked by. It was as if the air grew heavier. Silence would fall instantly, and even the boldest voices would drop. There was no room for mistakes in front of him. I'll admit, on some days I even prayed silently when I saw Richard approaching. Lord, guard my words so I don't say anything wrong. It was a mix of respect and unease that everyone seemed to share. Richard was known for being cold, distant, a man who wore the weight of his success like armor. Nothing escaped his eyes, and everyone who worked there knew if he decided something was wrong, there was no turning back. Many saw this as arrogance, but I learned to look at it differently. Because behind that rigid exterior, I often wondered if there was an untold story, a hidden faith no one dared to imagine. On certain mornings, I caught myself reflecting, do people that powerful ever kneel in prayer? When they close the door to their luxurious office, do they also speak with God in secret? That thought lingered in my mind. I believed every human being, no matter how wealthy or influential, carried a vulnerable side. But in Richard's case, it seemed impossible to spot even the smallest crack in that wall of authority. And yet, there was something curious. As feared as he was, I never felt he looked at me with disdain. Unlike other executives who barely offered a greeting, Richard always gave me a subtle nod, almost unnoticeable, yet filled with a quiet respect. I couldn't explain it, but it felt as though he was hiding more than he revealed. Deep down, I carried the sense that God was about to uncover something about him, and that expectation followed me like a constant whisper. Maybe that's the mystery of life. While everyone else only sees the surface, God is already writing an invisible storyline. Without realizing it, I was being prepared to witness a side of Richard no one thought existed. And it wouldn't take long, because the silence in those hallways was about to give way to whispers that would change the way everyone saw that man. If there's one thing that never fails in any workplace, it's the famous whispers in the hallways. And in that company, it was no different. There was always someone with a new story about Richard Cole. Comments about how he treated the directors, about million-dollar decisions, and even personal rumors that, deep down, no one really knew if they were true. It was as if every word spoken about him carried a touch of fear and a good dose of curiosity. The champion of spreading those rumors was Monica Perez, my coworker at reception. All it took was Richard walking by, and minutes later, she already had a comment ready. Did you know he never smiles? I even heard that in his own house, everything is calculated. I would smile, but inside I thought, how many people love talking about others without ever knowing their real story? It's funny how someone's silence can create more speculation than 1,000 words ever could. In the middle of those conversations, I was learning an important lesson. Things are not always what they seem. How often do we judge without realizing what God is building behind the scenes? It reminded me that even my own life, as simple as it looked, could easily be misinterpreted by those who only saw the surface. How many times had someone looked at me and assumed I was just a receptionist without dreams? They had no idea about the prayers I whispered every single day. Once during a break, Monica said to me, "Kylie, have you noticed that nobody knows anything about his life? It's like a wall." I calmly replied,
And what if it's exactly because he has something worth protecting? Mystery isn't always a sign of arrogance. She laughed, as if she couldn't believe in anything beyond what her eyes could see. But inside, I felt God was going to show me a side of that man the hallways could never guess. Those conversations made me reflect on how easy it is to spread words, but how hard it is to keep silent. My mom always said, "Daughter, those who pray spend less time talking about others and more time talking to God." I'll admit, I didn't always manage to live by that, but around Monica, I tried not to feed the gossip. I preferred to watch. I preferred to wait, because life had already taught me that at some point, testimony speaks louder than any rumor. And what no one could have imagined was that behind the cold walls of that building were secrets that couldn't be uncovered by whispers. Secrets that only reveal themselves when God decides to lift the veil. I had no idea, but I was about to witness something that would shatter every rumor into pieces and write a new chapter in my story.
It was the end of the workday, and the company hallways were quieter than usual. The lights had already started to dim, and I was taking a moment to organize my desk before leaving. That's when I heard a faint sound coming from a room at the end of the corridor. At first, I thought it was just another executive finishing up paperwork, but something caught my attention. It wasn't the sound of a keyboard or a conversation. It was a different kind of whisper. Curious, I walked closer, trying not to make noise with my heels. The door was slightly open, and I could have just kept walking, but something held me back. When I looked inside, I could hardly believe my eyes. Richard Cole, the man everyone feared, was on his knees, on the carpet, eyes closed, praying in tongues. The scene felt almost impossible, as if God himself had opened a secret window for me to see. My heart raced. The man I only knew for his stern look and flawless posture was now broken before God. I couldn't help but remember my mother's words. "Daughter, never underestimate prayer, because it's in prayer that the deepest secrets of the heart are revealed." I would have never imagined that Richard, the untouchable billionaire, was in reality a man pouring out his faith when no one was watching. I froze. Part of me wanted to run away so I wouldn't intrude on such an intimate moment. But another part of me couldn't look away. It was like watching a living testimony right before my eyes, without the need for words. I even felt the urge to kneel right there in a hallway and pray my own prayer. After all, how many times had I asked God for a sign that he still heard my cries? And there it was, right in front of me. For a few seconds, that office felt like it had turned into a sanctuary. The silence of the building, the dim light, the sound of prayers and tongues, all of it created an atmosphere that shook me inside. It was as if God was inviting me to see beyond what my eyes were used to. And in that moment, I understood. The greatest stories of faith are often hidden in places no one dares to look. I didn't know if I should stay there or walk away, but something inside me told me that moment wasn't an accident. It was the beginning of something that would not only change the way I saw Richard, but also the course of my own life. Because when God chooses to surprise us, he uses the most unlikely encounters, and this was only the beginning.
That night, as I left the company, my heart was still racing. It felt like I had witnessed something my eyes were never meant to see. The image of Richard, on his knees in prayer, wouldn't leave my mind. How could I reconcile the hard, feared man everyone knew with the scene of someone so vulnerable before God? They seemed like two completely different people, yet bound together in the same body. On the subway ride home, I stayed silent, trying to process it all. My mind kept returning to the same question. Why does he hide this? Maybe out of fear of being judged, or because people just wouldn't understand? Deep down, I thought to myself, how many times had I also hidden my own prayers, as if I were ashamed to show my faith in public? It wasn't only his secret. In a way, it was part of my own testimony too. I couldn't help but compare it with my own routine. I was just a simple receptionist, always praying quickly during my lunch break, sometimes even glancing around to see if anyone noticed, as if showing faith was something forbidden within those corporate walls. But seeing Richard there made me realize that even the most powerful feel the need to hide in order to keep their connection with God alive. That moment taught me something profound. Prayer isn't about the place, it's about surrender. For days, I carried that shock inside me like a heavy secret. I wanted to tell someone, yet at the same time I felt I shouldn't. It was as if God had entrusted me with something too intimate to spread around. And honestly, I felt privileged. After all, how many people could say they had seen a billionaire in tears, humbled before the Creator? It was a scene no amount of money could ever buy. Still, there was a certain fear. What if he found out I had seen him? Would he be furious? The last thing I wanted was for that sacred moment to become a source of embarrassment. So I decided to keep it to myself, like someone guarding a rare jewel. Every time I remembered it, I whispered a prayer. Lord, may this vision be a reminder that a man's heart belongs to you, not to appearances. What I didn't know then was that this secret wouldn't stay hidden for long, because when God decides to reveal his plan, even what we try to keep in silence finds its way into the light. And with each passing day, more than surprise, I felt he was preparing my heart for something even greater.
The next day, when Richard walked past the front desk, I didn't know where to look. Part of me wanted to act like nothing had happened, but another part was restless, waiting for some sign that he had noticed me in that room. And that's exactly what happened. For a brief moment, our eyes met, and I felt something different, something words could never fully explain. It wasn't the usual cold, distant look. There was a quiet peace in his eyes, almost like a secret understanding, as if he knew I carried his secret with me. There was no anger, no indifference, just a deep look that seemed to say, "You saw who I really am, and that's okay." That touched me in a way I had never experienced before. It was as if God had connected us in silence. I spent the rest of the day trying to make sense of that feeling. It was strange, yet comforting at the same time. I had never been close to Richard, but that look felt like it opened an invisible door between us. I felt as though his faith had reached mine, and together they built a silent bridge. And inside me, a new prayer was born. Lord, if this encounter has a purpose, give me the wisdom to understand what to do. The curious thing is, no words were exchanged, no explanations, no comments, just a gesture of humanity in the middle of so much corporate formality. It's amazing how God can use even a single look to begin a story. Have you ever noticed how sometimes we don't need words to communicate trust? Sometimes just being present and letting silence speak is enough. That moment made me think about how many opportunities I've missed because I didn't look beyond appearances. How many times do we fail to see that behind a tough expression, there may be a heart crying out in prayer? Richard, the most feared man in the company, had now become, to me, living proof that God writes chapters the human eye can't understand at first glance. And from that day on, I knew something had changed. I couldn't explain exactly what it was, but it felt like a new page had been opened. And the most intriguing part was that this page wouldn't be written with words, but with silences full of meaning. And the next chapter of the story was already beginning to unfold right in front of me. In the days that followed, no one said a word. Richard didn't call me in, didn't scold me, and didn't even hint at what I had witnessed. But strangely enough, the silence between us began to carry weight. It wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like it held a hidden message. Somehow, I understood that he knew I was keeping his secret and trusted that I wouldn't use it against him. I realized that silence speaks too, and sometimes louder than any word. Richard kept walking past reception, always discreet, but there was a gentleness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. It felt like a wall had been broken, and now I could see the man behind the posture. That silence taught me something about God. Even in silence, he speaks, and when we're attentive, we hear more than we imagine. I also started noticing how I responded to silence myself. Before, I used to fill every moment with words, explanations, even excuses. But now, whenever I thought of Richard, I remembered my own silent prayers, the ones that never left my lips, but that God had heard. It was as if he was showing me, through this story, that silence is also a sacred space. Some people started to notice the change. Monica, for example, pointed out that I looked thoughtful every time Richard walked by. "Kylie, you've been different lately. Are you hiding something?" she asked with a laugh, having no idea of the truth. I just brushed it off. What I had seen wasn't office gossip. It was a living testimony, and I knew it couldn't be treated as a cheap curiosity. It was something to keep in my heart, the way Mary treasured the angel's words. And so that silence began shaping me. I became more attentive, listening more and speaking less. Deep down, it felt like God was training me to understand that not every revelation needs to be shared right away. Some have to mature inside us until the right time comes. Richard never said a word, but his silence taught me more than long speeches ever could. What I didn't know was that this season of silence would be interrupted in an unexpected way. Because when God decides to move his purpose forward, he doesn't just use words. He also uses advice. Simple phrases that come from the most unlikely people. And that's exactly how the next page of my story began to unfold. I couldn't keep it all to myself any longer. A few days later, I sat with my mom in the kitchen and told her what I had seen. While stirring her chamomile tea, she listened with that calm look in her eyes that always made me feel like a child again. When I finished, I waited for her to react with surprise, but she didn't. Instead, she gave a gentle smile, almost as if she already knew God had something greater planned behind that moment. My mother has always been a woman of prayer. How many times did I find her on her knees beside the bed, late into the night, interceding for me and for our family? So when she heard my story, all she said was, "Daughter, God still hides princes in concrete palaces." That sentence went straight to my heart. It was like a window of hope had opened, one I didn't even know existed. I was speechless. I had never thought of Richard as a prince. In fact, he seemed more like an iron king, untouchable. But my mother taught me something priceless. Faith lets us see what our natural eyes cannot. "Kylie," she went on, "don't just look at what he shows. Look at what God is revealing. It's in the hidden details that he writes the greatest testimonies." I spent days reflecting on her words. Princes in concrete palaces. It became almost like a prayer inside me. Every time I thought of Richard's eyes, I remembered my mother's words as well. I realized that while I only saw a powerful and feared man, God was already inviting me to see a heart that found comfort in prayer, and that completely changed the way I looked at him. My mother has always had this gift of turning life into simple phrases that carry deep wisdom. I remembered other times when her words carried me, when I lost my first job, when I cried for not feeling good enough, or when I thought God had forgotten me. It was always her who reminded me, "Daughter, your story is still being written, and God is never late." And that's exactly what I held on to from that night, the certainty that something was being built beyond what I could see. I didn't know how or when, but I felt that the secret I carried wasn't just about Richard. It was about me too. And soon, very soon,
that mystery would begin to unfold before my eyes in a way I could never have imagined.
It was just an ordinary morning. I was taking care of the front desk calls when the internal phone rang. On the other end, Richard's personal secretary asked me to go up to the 40th floor. My heart started racing. I had never been called to speak with him directly. In the elevator, my hands were sweating and my mind was flooded with questions. When I walked into his office, Richard was standing by the huge glass window that overlooked all of New York City. He didn't look like the stern billionaire everyone feared. His expression was different, almost gentle. With a small gesture, he asked me to sit down. I obeyed in silence, trying to steady the anxiety that was taking over me. He began by saying he knew I had seen something I wasn't supposed to see. My heart stopped for a moment, but instead of a harsh reaction, I heard words I never imagined would come from his mouth. Faith is my greatest strength, Kylie. It's what keeps me standing when the world expects me to fall apart. That confession, coming from such a powerful man, felt like a sacred secret he was sharing with me. I didn't know what to say. I just took a deep breath and told him I understood. He looked me in the eyes, and in that moment, I realized this wasn't just a work conversation. It felt as if God had placed me there to witness that even the strongest people need prayer. That moment became a milestone in my life, something I could never erase from my memory. Richard then told me he didn't trust many people, but for some reason he felt peace in telling me this. "Don't tell anyone about it," he asked, almost pleading. I promised I would keep it to myself, and at the same time, deep inside, a flame of faith began to grow. I understood that this secret wasn't just his. It was also a responsibility God had placed in my hands. When I left his office, it felt like I had walked through an invisible door. I went in as just a receptionist, but I came out carrying a silent calling, a bond that connected me to Richard's life and to what God was writing. I didn't know where this road would take me, but I was sure my mother was right. God truly does hide princes in concrete palaces. After that conversation, I felt something different between us. It wasn't just professional respect. It was as if two souls had silently recognized each other before God. Every gesture he made, every carefully chosen word, seemed to carry more meaning than any meeting or business decision. I realized we were building a connection that went far beyond the usual corporate routine. Richard didn't need to say much for me to understand. There were small signs. The way he looked at me when I spoke, the unexpected patience in explaining work details, even the moments when he seemed to seek my opinion on something simple. All of it felt like it was saying, "You are different, and I see that." And I felt that God was guiding every step of this growing closeness. In just a few days, in those quiet hallways, I could already feel a sense of mutual understanding. It wasn't romance yet, but there was something deep that only faith could explain. It's amazing how God uses small gestures to reveal great truths. Sometimes a glance or a subtle word can completely change the way we see someone, and even how we see ourselves. I admit, I often found myself reflecting on how hearts can recognize each other without words. It felt as if he was teaching me to trust not only my intuition, but also divine timing. Because when God writes stories, he doesn't need to rush anything. He just needs hearts willing to notice his direction. My prayers quietly began to include Richard too. I asked God to guide our steps, protect our hearts, and reveal, at the right time, everything that needed to be revealed. It was the first time I felt that a prayer could directly touch someone else's life, and it left me with a strange yet beautiful feeling inside. And so, day by day, we started building a space of mutual trust. I still didn't know how things would unfold, but I could feel that we were about to experience moments no rumor or gossip in the hallways could ever predict. Something greater was forming, and God was the silent author of this story. In the days that followed, I noticed Richard starting to open up little by little,
not with grand words, but with small gestures, full of meaning. A lingering glance, a warmer greeting, or even a casual mention of a Bible verse in conversation. Everything was quiet, yet it spoke directly to my heart. I felt privileged to witness this side of him. Every gesture was a sign of trust, as if he were testing whether I could understand his faith without judgment. I began to realize that he was approaching me silently, but with clear intentions, letting me see that God was in control of everything, including our lives. At times, he even asked me for small prayers for work or company matters. That touched me deeply because it showed he trusted God as much as he trusted me. It was strange to see such a powerful man, someone everyone considered untouchable, humbly submitting to prayer. Every request was a silent testimony of the faith he kept hidden. I admit that fulfilling these small requests, I felt closer to him. It was as if, little by little, our hearts were tuning into each other, not just out of respect, but for something greater. I began to see that God's presence between us didn't depend on formal words, but on quiet surrender, on faith shared without fanfare. I also noticed subtle acts of care. Sometimes he would offer me a coffee or check if I needed anything, as if these little gestures carried a deeper meaning than simple politeness. I began to understand that in life, God works in the details, and it is in these details that he reveals his presence and writes unexpected stories. And so, between glances, prayers, and discreet gestures, something began to bloom. I still didn't know that this would lead to true love, but I felt that every silent move Richard made was preparing the ground for a future only God could write. And little did I know, the next surprise was about to happen.
6 months had passed since that unexpected encounter, and something no one could have imagined happened. Richard asked me to marry him. It felt like a moment straight out of a dream, yet it was living proof that God writes stories that human reason often cannot understand. My heart raced, and with every word he spoke, I felt that everything had been guided by divine hands. It wasn't an extravagant proposal, full of pomp. It was simple, intimate, filled with emotion and faith. He looked me in the eyes and said that all this time, our shared prayers and quiet moments had revealed something greater, that God had brought us together for something beyond the corporate world. Every gesture, every prayer had prepared the way. I still remembered all the glances, the small gestures, and the Bible verses he had let slip at the right moments. Now, looking at him, I realized that every detail had been a divine rehearsal for this moment. My own faith had grown, and I understood that God had been present in every step of this story, improbable yet completely real. The joy was so overwhelming that all I could think about was sharing the news with my mother. She, who had always taught me about prayer and trust in God, was moved to see that her words about princes in concrete palaces were coming true before our eyes. It was a living testimony that faith and prayer transform lives and open doors that no one else can open. And even with all of Richard's wealth and power, I realized that his greatest treasure wasn't money. It was the faith that sustained him. Every prayer he had kept in secret, every moment of vulnerability was now blooming into love and closeness. It was proof that God writes stories for those with patience and an open heart. And so, in that moment, what began as curiosity and admiration transformed into something greater, a love grounded in faith, trust, and surrender to God. I knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter, where every prayer, every gesture, and every shared silence would continue to strengthen our story, guided by God Himself.
The day of the wedding arrived, and I couldn't hold back my emotions. Standing before Richard, now my fiancé, and realizing that all of this was God's work filled my heart with gratitude. Pastor Stephen Wallace led the ceremony with a presence that made the moment even more sacred, and I felt that every prayer surrounded us, as if heaven itself were witnessing our union. It wasn't just a formal union, but a spiritual commitment. Every word spoken by the pastor resonated deeply within us. I remembered my mother's words, the silent prayers at work, and all of Richard's discreet gestures. Now it all made sense, showing that God writes stories that often no one imagines. During the ceremony, I noticed the looks of respect and admiration he inspired in those around us. But for me, Richard's greatest treasure wasn't there, nor in the possessions everyone knew about. It was in his faith, in that quiet surrender that had touched me so deeply. It was proof that true greatness comes from a heart surrendered to God, not from titles or wealth. The sense of peace was indescribable. Every step to the altar seemed guided by invisible hands, leading us to a greater purpose. I felt God's presence in every detail, from the sparkle in the pastor's eyes to the gentle music accompanying our vows. Every prayer we prayed together echoed in my heart as a living testimony of God's faithfulness. After the ceremony, as we looked out the window of our new home, I felt that we had begun something greater than ourselves. It wasn't just a life together. It was a story written with faith, prayer, and surrender. Every gesture, every shared smile was a reminder that God truly transforms lives and reveals His glory in unexpected ways. And so, we began our life together, knowing that this wasn't just a human happily ever after, but a new chapter reflecting the truest wealth, faith. In Christ, we discovered that love blooms, prayer has power, and every story God writes is unique, special, and worthy of being shared to inspire other hearts to trust in Him. Looking back, I can hardly believe the journey God has written in my life. From a receptionist in a large company, always in the shadows, to the wife of a man who prayed in secret. Every silent moment, every prayer, every act of faith I witnessed has now become a testimony that needs to be shared. I realize that God writes improbable stories precisely to reveal His power. Sometimes we expect grand signs, but He uses quiet encounters and discreet moments to transform lives. My story isn't just about love or success, it's about faith and surrender, about recognizing that God works even when no one is watching. Today, I share my experience to inspire others to believe that nothing is impossible for those who trust. Every prayer we prayed together, every secret kept with reverence, served to show that faith doesn't need to be displayed. It needs to be lived. True wealth lies in listening to God and following His guidance, even when everything around you seems to contradict it. And I want you to understand this. Your story can also be written by Him in surprising ways. How many times have you underestimated simple moments, glances, meetings, or words that could change your life? God is active in the small things, and what seems improbable is often just a chapter He is preparing for you. If my story touched you, share your faith as well. Here on the Faith Story channel, we've shared my experience, but there's room for your testimony too. Write in the comments how God has been working in your life and inspire others to trust in the power of prayer and His faithfulness. Remember,
Stories like mine show that faith isn't just a belief, it's a path of transformation. Every moment of prayer, every act of trust, every heart surrendered to God can produce miracles, reveal unexpected love, and completely change someone's life. May your faith be the next story that touches the world.